Hey guys, Miss Fox here with part 4 of your 7.3 flipped classroom. If you haven't watched the other parts yet, go back, watch those first. Don't forget you should be taking notes, writing the left-hand side questions down, highlighting all that super duper very important information as we go, okay? And we were on, when we ended part 3, Johnson getting impeached. So we're going to pick up from there for part 4 here. All right, so Johnson is impeached, which means that they're trying to fire him. Remember, it doesn't mean you get fired. It means you're going to go through a process to see if you should be fired, okay, by going through a trial. Again, he's the first president that's going to experience this, but we've had 2 others since him, Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. All 3 of these guys, though, have not actually been fired. In addition to that, there was another president in the 1970s, Richard Nixon, who had committed a crime, the Watergate scandal. You guys will learn about that in high school. And he was guilty, and they were going to impeach him, and he totally would have been fired, but he quits before that can happen because he knows darn well that he's going to lose his job. So he quits before they can fire him. So never technically impeached, but they would have impeached him. Okay, so Johnson, what's the deal with Johnson? Why did he get impeached? What's going on? So Johnson, not happy about the Military Reconstruction Act, which you remember we talked about on slide 8, right? Where the military is going to come in and have 5 zones, right? That they are going to watch over in the old Confederacy, making sure former Confederate states are following all the new rules and letting Freedmen's Bureau do their job, and the 13th and 14th Amendment are being followed and things, okay? So he's not happy about that. So he decides that he's going to fire the Secretary of War, okay, who is a radical Republican. Remember, his mortal enemy, right, because he's a Democrat. And radical Republicans are as Republican as you can get, okay? And so it's his mortal enemy. He's the Secretary of War, so he's in charge, you know, has a lot to do with these 5 military zones and the military being down in the ex-Confederate states. And he wants to replace him with somebody who's not going to reinforce that law. He doesn't want military in heavily, you know, presence down in these 5 districts and them controlling everything, because he's a Southerner and he's a racist and he doesn't like all this Reconstruction crap, okay? So he's not happy and he wants to put somebody there that's not going to do their job. So the House of Representatives impeached Johnson in 1867, which means, again, they're trying to remove him from office, accusing him of the Tenure Office Act, which was a law in place prohibiting a president from removing any executive department officer who had already been appointed by somebody else. So Lincoln had appointed him. You can't fire him just because you don't like the guy, said the law at the time, okay? That is no longer a law today, but at the time it was a law. So he goes to trial, and the Senate holds the trial. Senate always holds the impeachment proceeding trials, and they determine whether or not Johnson or whichever the president that's getting impeached, you know, if they're guilty or not. Well, Johnson, by a single vote, you guys, 1 measly vote, is found innocent, and he is not fired from his presidency. Kind of ironic about this because, you know, all of us people that are all about equal rights and don't want racism in the world would love to see Johnson impeached, right? He was a horrible president and we want him gone. So 1 vote, oh my goodness, wow. But what's kind of ironic is the reason why they were trying to impeach him is breaking this Tenure Office Act law, right? Later, the Supreme Court ends up ruling that that law is unconstitutional. Hello, like, just because some other dude hired you doesn't mean I can't fire you if I'm now in charge. I mean, think about that. That's like at any business. You had a boss that hired you once upon a time, and that boss gets a promotion or moves or dies or retires or whatever, and now you have a new boss. What, that boss can never fire you even if you're doing a horrible job because, you know, you got hired by somebody else? That makes no sense. So yeah, it ends up becoming unconstitutional. If only it had worked before that happened and Johnson was impeached, but he wasn't. He got to hang on to his job by 1 vote. So after he's impeached, he gets like, wow, okay, people are more frustrated with me than I ever really realized. And he's more cooperative throughout the rest of his tenure in office as president about Reconstruction and Reconstruction laws and reform movements. But he has grown more and more unpopular as his presidency has continued. The South looks at him as a failure because, hey, dude, you're a Southerner, you are, a former slave owner, you should be helping us out, and the South doesn't feel like he's helping them enough. The North doesn't like him because they feel like that he's helping the South too much, right? And so he just can't win. Remember, this guy was never elected to be president, guys. He becomes president by default because Lincoln died. And so he was never voted into this position, and he just grows in unpopularity as his time in office continues. And so he'll end up failing to even get a nomination to run for the Democratic Party in the next presidential election. And so in 1868, the Democrats really don't have a chance. They're a mess because Johnson's made this big mess and nobody likes him and he doesn't get the nomination and the other guy's kind of unknown. And so Ulysses S. Grant, Civil War hero, right? Ulysses S. Grant becomes the 18th president of the United States in 1868, and Johnson doesn't get another term. So Johnson's a one-term president who never even got elected in, loses popularity by the end of the day, and people are ready for a change. People are ready to get Reconstruction really amped up. Let's get it through, let's get it done, and move on to other things. Ulysses S. Grant is a war hero. He's recognized by everyone. He has supporters in the South, not a lot, but he does have some. And then, of course, the North just loves this guy, right? And so he wins the 1868 election and will become the next president, president number 18. Draw a line underneath everything you just wrote, guys, all the way across your page. And here's stuff about Andrew Johnson as president, as well as him getting impeached and that whole story. Okay, so take a look at those. And then, of course, we got Ulysses S. Grant and his deal on him as president. So take a look at those as well. All right, number 10, the 15th Amendment. Man, we hadn't talked about an amendment since way back in first semester, and now we've done the 13th and the 14th, and here comes the 15th Amendment. So when Grant wins the election of 1868, by the way, he partially wins that because remember, in order for a state to come back into the Union legally, they had to have in their state constitution that black males were allowed to vote. So some of the votes Grant gets, of course, if you're an African American male, you're going to vote for Grant. You're going to vote for the Republican Party. They helped get him in. Despite that African Americans were voting and helped Grant become president, there was a lot of pressure on African Americans. A group called the KKK, which we'll talk about in a minute, had sprung up and had threatened voters and beaten them and killed them. You were literally, I'm not exaggerating, guys, you were risking your life as an African American male to go to a place where voting was taking place to vote. Whites did not in the South want you voting. Okay, huge amounts of racism about this. Remember, they don't want to look at them as equals. They don't want this equal rights stuff. And so they just really tensions, put them through the ringer and did everything they could to stop blacks from voting. And so they are voting anyway, okay? Some of them are getting turned away. Some of them are disappearing. Some of them are getting beat up, but some of them are making their way to the polls and being able to vote. That helps Grant win. Well, once Grant's in office, these radical Republicans that are in Congress right now who love Grant, right? They're all Republican now. They're all going to get along. Well, they're worried that, hey, we just saw from this last election that while African Americans did vote, there were a lot of problems. There were death threats, there were murders, there were all kinds of things taking place to try to stop blacks from voting. We need to stop that and again, make it crystal clear this is not okay because it already should be law in all these southern states that they can vote. Remember, it was part of their constitution to come back into the Union. But nobody's following the law. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to make it the most, important. It sticks out. You can't break this kind of law we've got access to. We're going to amend the U.S. Constitution again. And that's how we get the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment says that a citizen cannot be stopped from voting on the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So just because they used to be a slave doesn't mean they can't vote. Okay, the 15th Amendment passes. All right, we still have it and follow it today. Does that mean that all African Americans go to places to vote moving forward with no problems? No, there's still a lot of heartache and issues for blacks as they try to vote for a number of years up through the 1960s. Okay, so like when people you know were alive in your life, African Americans were still being denied the right to vote in a lot of places in the United States. But the 15th Amendment did help, okay? It did help, it did make a difference, and it is a fundamental change once again in our US Constitution, okay? So draw a line underneath everything you just wrote all the way across your page. Give yourself a left-hand side question. Of course, we've got video clips for you. Make sure you check those out, okay? So in the beginning, in the beginning of them being able to vote, African Americans do gain power because they're going out to the polls. They help get Grant elected. We end up having the first African American members of the U.S. Congress. This is huge, you guys. Okay, so 16 blacks over the course of Reconstruction are elected to U.S. Congress. However, all of this, like, blacks are voting and we're making it into Congress and we're making gains of political power. It is temporary because after these initial gains, the South is really going to push down harder. They don't like the gains that the blacks are making. They don't like African Americans in Congress. Okay, so they're going to do everything they can to put a stop to this. They're going to find loopholes. They're going to break the law. They're going to do everything they can to put the black man down, to stop African Americans from gaining power in society. And so for a while, you see this brief moment where it's like, hey, we're making positive impact and, you know, political gains and power. And then you're going to desperately see that fall off. And from 1878 to 1855, just kidding, from 1878 to 1955, there's no African Americans elected into the Senate, and never more than 2 at any one time in the House, and sometimes none in the House, because they are stopped from voting and, you know, being part of the political process. Okay, so leading into that, I'm talking about undermining these amendments. So it was very commonplace for the South to try to ignore the 13th Amendment banning slavery, the 14th Amendment giving them equal citizenship under the law, and the 15th Amendment giving black men the right to vote. Very commonly, they tried to ignore these guys. They do not want a system where African Americans have equality to whites. Does everybody think that way? No. Are there Southerners that agree with the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment? Yes. Do most Northerners agree? Yes. But unfortunately, a lot of the South disagrees with these amendments, and some of the North disagrees with these amendments too. So especially the 14th and 15th Amendments are being violated a lot. How? Through mental and physical abuse, through threats of violence, through actual violence against African Americans in the South. Very rarely would police get involved or be of any kind of help. Very rarely would leadership in the state at the government level, you know, get involved and help, because the South had a lot of corrupt officials in charge of counties and whole states, you know, at a time. And so it would be very hard for an African American who's supposed to have the right to vote with no problem at all to actually vote. Okay. Eventually, after Reconstruction's over, they're going to start in the South introducing these things called poll taxes, where you had to pay a tax to vote. African Americans were often poor, just starting out with their freedom, right? Didn't have the money to do this. They created grandfather clauses where, hey, in order for you to vote, your family had to be qualified to vote before the Civil War. We're going to grandfather that in, like your grandfather had to be able to vote. Well, of course, no African Americans could vote before the Civil War, so that automatically would disqualify them. They also had literacy tests that got introduced in the 1890s after Reconstruction ends. that you had to pass, these tests you had to pass. And if you got one question wrong, one wrong on these very overcomplicated tests, you were out and you couldn't vote. Okay, we're gonna have one more section, guys, so I'll see you when you come back for our last part for this PowerPoint. All right, see you then.